Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be tuning in from, wherever in the world you might be. Welcome to the Future Law Virtual Summit 2020 at Negotiating the New Normal. Today we have a very special session to explore the future skills for present lawyers. I think a very relevant and important topic. And we're joined by James Perreira and Zita W. The last name you pronounce?
Wa-Tulyahikayo.
Could you repeat it again? It's a beautiful name.
Wa-Tulyahikayo.
Wa-Tulyahikayo. Wonderful. Thank you both so much for being here today. And I'd like to just start off by asking you to introduce yourself and describe a little bit about how you have how you've led to do the work that you are now doing.
Great question.
Sure. Well, shall I kick off? So, yeah, my name's James Perreira. I'm a Silk. I'm a QC at the bar, but I'm also a systemic coach. So I coach individuals and lawyers. I'm an author. I've written some law books and some contributed to a book on coaching. And I'm a visiting professor of law at King's College in London. So I kind of come from both sides, if you like. And for me, and I can come onto it later with a little bit of our talk, it's really been, for me, a question of my own kind of personal journey and the insights that I got, really struggling with how to fit in a kind of very conventional legal context and with the kind of values that came with me through legal education, and really then being hit with this idea, you know, do I kind of quit and get out and do something else, or kind of fight from the outside, or do I stay on the inside and figure out a new way of doing things and try and bring about change that way? And luckily for me, it was the last of those that I found, and that's a bit about what we'll talk about today, but that's part of my journey.
Hi, so I'm Zita. I originally started my working career in fashion, but whilst living in California and America, I decided to change career path. I trained as a hypnotherapist, and part of our graduation training is we got to practice on lawyers at the California bar, which is notoriously difficult. And what I found amazing was that the California bar entrusted its most talented members to be hypnotized so that they could easily pass the bar. And I guess it was my interest in working with lawyers that started there, and over the arc of 15 years of working as a hypnotherapist and a coach, and now as a systemic coach and facilitator, I really started to understand how performance can be improved by understanding our relationship, not just to ourselves, but to all the systems that we belong to, not just the system of our body, but the system of our culture, our country, our family. All of these inform how we go out into the world and how we perform in it, and actually how we even perceive our roles and performance in the future.
Wonderful. Thank you guys so much for that lovely introduction. And I understand that you have a short talk prepared for us, or some words to share.
It follows on quite nicely from what you're asking, actually. So we're going to introduce a few ideas and some of our perspectives, and we'll be going into that in more depth in our workshop. So let me just get right in there and let me start with a story. And this first story is about understanding our personal role within the system and taking responsibility for it. You know, we have this buzzword, systemic and systemic solutions and systemic thinking and so on, but what does it actually mean? And that's part of really what we're going to be touching upon today in our talk. So I started off as a barrister in 1996, and I was working in a chambers in Temple in London, which some of you may know is a very kind of historic part of London. I used to walk to work down this little cobbled street with a narrow lane, and I go in through this ancient doorway, and I plod up this very steep wooden set of stairs to get into the place where I worked. And you could literally feel the kind of history and tradition kind of get layered on you more and more as you went further and further and further up the stairs. And I'd walk in, and I was very aware of the messaging that we used to get given in those days. Things like, and I should say, they still get given it now. The young kids who are coming through law school, they still get given it now. Things like, you know, you can't make mistakes. You've got to burn the midnight oil and work hard if you want to be successful. You can't turn work away because otherwise you'll damage your practice and others will succeed. in your place. You're only as good as your last case or your last client. All of these kind of things that you take on board without really questioning it, and people live them. So I worked really hard, as many do, and I took on lots of work. I was always the guy who was willing to kind of take on a set of instructions at the last minute. Things come on a Friday night for Monday morning, I'd do it. If it involved cancelling my social engagements, I'd do that. And I really took that almost as a kind of badge of honor, you know, being somebody who was willing to sacrifice myself for my clients in that way, even to the extent of, you know, taking on the cases that other lawyers wouldn't touch with a barge polish. To get a huge amount of pleasure from doing that. And of course, the success came, but at the same time, a lot of the things that a lot of lawyers face now and have done, I think, for generations, although they haven't talked about it, were coming my way. You know, the no life-work balance at all, the stress, the late nights, the coffee, the drink, whatever it might be. And I can remember kind of scrambling around for solutions and being told the same old things by everyone. Oh, well, you know, that's just life in the law, right? That's what you have to, that's what you've kind of bought into. That's what you have to put up with. Or just book a holiday. Just make sure you book your holidays in advance. And that way, you know, you'll be able to rest when things come along. Or, oh, let's just all go out for a drink and you know, and get a bit merry, and it'll all be all right in the morning, kind of thing. And you do that, and it would literally be kind of, you know, wash, rinse, cycle, repeat type thing. And what I really was aware of is that there weren't any solutions being offered to me from inside. And as much as I complained, I wasn't really, if I'm honest, in a position, I didn't really have the resources to get out of this cycle. And then someone suggested to me, well, maybe there's another way of looking at it. And I guess over to you, Zita.
So in many ways, that's where we start looking from a systemic perspective. I'll go a little, try and break it down into chunks, but by nature as humans, we are pack animals and we are complicit. We learn to walk so that we can keep up with the tribe when the tribe moves on. And when you take that behavior pattern into modern life, we join a profession, we join a tribe, and we obey the rules of the tribe, even if they may potentially be detrimental to our health, our own well-being, and ultimately to the progress of the tribe itself. So the lawyer becomes complicit in the behavior that is the accepted rule, and they agree, and the law as a profession says, this is what you must do in order to belong. We go, okay, I'll do it to belong. And invariably both end up suffering. That's a systemic view of a situation rather than, oh, I must just keep going on because it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, so for me, I guess, I mean, what I'm about to tell you is how I managed to remedy this for me. And let me say, first of all, now when I look back on it with hindsight, it seems blindingly obvious. At the time, I couldn't see it at all, and it was completely in my blind spot. And one of the things I'd like people watching this to bear in mind is this question of, you know, when we rebel against the system and say, it's not fair, I'm being made to do this or I'm being made to do that, is to ask, actually, what role are we playing in that? And what part are we playing in that? And what responsibility do we need to take for that? And so for us, systemic thinking is not only about looking outside, it's also about looking inside and understanding our role and our part that we play in the wider system. So for me, I couldn't overcome overwork, and no matter how much I shouted against the system, until I resolved my relationship with my father. That's where it came from. There I was in my 20s and 30s, very successful, but what was actually at play here, I discovered through coaching, was a dynamic that I'd learned growing up. So my father was a very kind of distant figure. And as a child, I was always trying to get his attention and some kind of sign of approval or reward or affection. So in order to do that, I would often compromise what maybe I wanted for myself and try and think, you know, what does he need to feel better? What might I do in order for him to see me? Things like that. You translate, you keep that pattern into an adult who then goes into the legal profession, who doesn't have daddy there anymore, but has clients. And you can start to see how that rolls out. Client comes in, oh, what do I want to do? I really want to please you because I want to feel good and get that support and accreditation and affirmation and affection from you for doing a good job. How am I going to do that? Do you know what? I'm perfectly willing to give up a lot of the stuff that I would like for myself, my social contacts, my weekend plans, my sleep, whatever it might be, because I really crave the pleasure I get when I get the sound, you know, the signals back that I did a good job, or oh, thank you for turning it around so quickly, or whatever it was. So for me, it was a question of dealing with my internal dynamics and my family system in order to then be able to stand more confidently and more competently in the legal system. And this connection between systems, between our family systems, our belonging, our culture, those values, and what we bring with us when we step into the office is so, so important, because we can't see, we're so used to it. It's very difficult for us to see without a system. But when we can untangle it, then we can really be more resourced. And so for me, when I done that, it meant that I could actually serve my clients' needs for their own sake, not because I wanted something out of it, not putting myself first with the consequence that I would help my client, but putting the client first, thinking, what do they need? And coming to them from a place of strength, and also a place where I could resource myself by saying, you know, I can do that for you, but I'm going to need this, that, and the other. You don't ask me to, you know, work 24/7 in order to deliver this piece of work, because that's not going to work out well for either of us. So this is how we're going to do it. And I can have far more open, resourceful conversation. So back to that question I started with, understanding our personal role in the system and taking responsibility for it. That's one piece. And we're going to be looking at that in a bit more depth in the workshop, right?
Absolutely. So one of the challenges we face in overcoming a situation like that, and indeed what this conference is about, it's about the future. Traditionally, we always look at the future from the place which we are standing in, which is the present. So what's unusual, or perhaps particular and unique, and what I find very exciting about the systemic approach, is we go from the Greek principle of chiron time, which is the past, present, and future are all happening in the same time as, and they're stacked on top of each other, rather in the way we generally look at them as a forward motion. So from James's story, we hear how a past experience informs his behavior in the present, and therefore guides his decision in the future. If we change the way we perceive the past, our behavior in the present becomes different and informs us, or allows us to make different and perhaps better choices for the future, rather than them being informed by the limitations of our loyalties. They become expansive as we release ourselves from the limiting patterns that allow us to belong. And that brings us to another aspect, back actually to belonging, because belonging is motivated by love. We rarely talk about love, but love is loyalty, loyalty to the firm, loyalty to the family. And that is the bit that is often very difficult for us as individuals to change, because it threatens our survival. It threatens our ability to be loved and be accepted and welcomed. And we all want to feel welcomed, because that means we're more likely to live longer. So how do we adjust the way we feel about belonging? How do we change the pattern of the past that allowed us to belong to our father or to our family to a different kind of belonging, in which we turn what is perceived as a weakness actually into a strength, rather than what we tend to do is put our weaknesses in a box and say, oh no, they're a weakness, I'm going to be super strong. But actually, without the strength and the power that is hidden within the weaknesses, we don't change. Yeah. We remain the same.
So I want to say something about that now. So really talking about this idea of transformation, of turning what you might see as a weakness into a strength. And that idea of, I think you mentioned, Zita, the word expansion or expansiveness. In other words, where can these thoughts and different perspectives take you? And one of the things that we're really keen on ensuring that we do when we work with people is giving people, you know, tangible results, like real life practical things that they can actually use in the workplace. And of course, a lot of law is about collaboration. You know, a lot of transactional law is about collaboration, and there's a lot of alternative dispute resolution and so on. But a lot of it is about conflict, and it's very kind of easy to shy away from conflict, or to look down upon conflict as something maybe we should avoid. But the reality is conflict is there. And so one of the things I want to touch upon now, and again we'll be looking at it in the workshop, is how you can actually resource conflict in this way. So here's the question, really, and it's another systemic question. What do the relationships, what are the relationships that we're in, and what do we need, and how can we bring to them what they need? What are the relationships we're in, what do they need, and how can we bring to them what we need? So here's another story of something that I was doing a few years ago, after I'd done quite a lot of my systemic and coaching training. And I was instructed by a public authority in what's called a compulsory purchase case. In America, it's called eminent domain. It's the mechanism by which the state can take away, with statutory authority, land from a private person. They have to pay compensation, but if they get the order confirmed, they can take away by compulsion people's private property. And so we had an inquiry into this particular matter, and the land that was in part of the site comprised 2 shops and some flats. And there was an objector, and it was an Indian family, a South Indian family. And the lady that was there, who was the mother, she had come over, her and her husband had come over in the 1960s and rented this shop. And through their hard work, they'd earned enough to buy the shop. And through more hard work, they bought the flat on top and rented the flat out. And then it went on, and they bought the premises next door and the flat next door. And they had this lovely business, which for them really embodied the history of their journey, of all the kind of trials and failures and successes and the emotions of where they've been for the last 40 years. And what they wanted to do was pass it on to their children as a legacy. And we were going to take it away. Our client was going to take this away from them. And I had to stand up and cross-examine this lady to try and show that her objections were not sustainable. And yeah, not a place that advocates normally relish being in. So again, I guess the question for me was, what was the most resourceful way that I could approach this very real life lawyer task? Zita, I don't know if you want to say something at that point.
Let's hear more of the story, and then I'll give you some.
Yeah. So one of the things that we are taught as lawyers is really to reason, right? So much so that reason is treated as the power and the authority, and emotion and what your body is feeling very much treated as secondary, a dangerous distraction. Even systemic teaching and systemic coaching looks differently at that. It takes a holistic approach. We listen to what we feel, we value what we feel, we think of that as giving us information. And so what was coming up for me as I stood there was, what am I feeling? And the overwhelming feeling I had was one of anger and sadness and grief. In other words, that's what this lady was feeling. And so another thing that we talk about is relationship. What's in the space between me and you, or me and my opponent, or me and the judge, or me and the witness, whatever it might be? What's in that space? Or to go back to the question, what's the relationship? What does it need? And how can we bring it? So that made me think, what do I need to acknowledge here? And so I turned to her and I said, it's my first question. I said to her, do you know what? It seems very much like this piece of land represents to you your struggle as an immigrant from when you arrived here in the 60s until where you are now, and your success and your challenges. And it must be really painful for you to face having this taken away. And she looked at me and she said, yes, it is. And you could see the tears welling up in her eyes. And I said, well, I think we should all take a moment and just sit here and acknowledge that. And so I didn't ask any more questions. I just went quiet and I held that space for, it seemed like a lifetime. It's probably only about 30 seconds. She started crying. Everyone else went quiet. Everyone went still. And you could literally feel like, the elephant in the room had suddenly been called out and named, and we were all looking at it and acknowledging it. And after that moment came to an end, I heard her sigh. And then I said, are you okay to continue now? And she went, yes. And we carried on. And I was able to ask her all sorts of questions that if that barrier had still been there, if that emotion had gone unacknowledged, I would not have been able to do. And so we often think of like so-called soft skills as being about collaboration and so on. And to an extent they are, of course, but they can also help us in conflict, in perhaps managing conflict in a different way that's still resourceful for our clients. It still gets us to places that our clients need to go, but it uses different aspects and different perspectives to bring something new, something different to the relationship.
Thank you. Which brings me to another aspect of what it is just to be a human working or having relationships that we rarely talk about, but we are all profoundly aware of in our experiences every day and forms part of our emotional intelligence, which is part of that relationship between conflict and tension is innocence and guilt. I'm innocent when I do what is right for me, but I am guilty to the other whilst I am doing it. And that's okay, but we feel that tension within ourselves. And when I do what is okay for the other, I am innocent to them, but I am guilty to myself. So often we blindly have this experience, and it impacts our ability to make clear, precise decisions. But once we are aware of it operating and how it feels in our body, how it informs, do I make a decision from my head, or do I make a decision from my heart, or do I make a decision that is a balance of both, honoring the feeling of guilt and innocence, then we're more likely to what is make a clear, concise decision, trusting and knowing that in the good that we do, there will be something that is not so great. And even in the things that we do that we think are not so great, something hidden good is always happening. And if we can hold this binary conflict as a simple truth of what it is to be human, to be a professional, to be a lawyer, to be involved in transactional relationships, or relationship dynamics with clients that might have conflict in them, then it becomes easier, as James showed in that example, to acknowledge what is happening for the other, but still achieve the outcome that we want to achieve that is right for our client. So that's another thing that we're going to be exploring, because actually most of the tensions that we experience, whether it's because of belonging or because of relationships, because of loyalty, are informed by this tension between guilt and innocence, which is always running along at the same time. There's wonderful imagery from one of the ancient religious traditions about, we have one shoulder, on one shoulder the angel of innocence, on the other shoulder the angel of guilt, and we're holding a candle, and each is lighting it and putting it out continuously throughout the course of our life. And each moment we are faced with this perpetual conflict and tension. And once we can understand how it's operating, what are the hidden dynamics where I'm being really loyal to this, but it is causing me a problem in my life, or it's restricting me from going into that expansive space of the future, then we can release ourselves from the tension of the guilt and take a step forward. So that's something else. We've got some wonderful exercises lined up in our play shop that allow us to recognize, feel into it, think into it, and find a way to then solve problems ourselves.
So that's it in a nutshell.
Wonderful. Thank you guys so much for sharing that, and being vulnerable enough to share your story, and the clarity of insight and wisdom that is just exuding from you. So I appreciate that. One of my questions that I'd love to pose to you guys is, because you're working with probably a whole range of different people who have different kinds of problems and challenges and obstacles, but if you sort of reflect on all of these, how do the sort of, well, first question is sort of, what are some of the common challenges that people are facing? And the follow-up question to that is, how do those challenges actually reflect the nature of our current normal or our system as it now is? So curious if you have any reflections on that.
Well, I guess in my one-to-one practice, what I have really noticed, particularly since the murder of George Floyd, and how that created a shift in the nature of our belonging and comes into an issue of diversity, is about do I have a right to succeed? Do I have a right to live well as a person of colour? Or must I not necessarily live so well because so many aren't? And that can and has been quietly always manifest, but we haven't really looked at it as closely as we're being invited to now. What does that mean to change these loyalties in our professional experience and in our personal experience? So that's one example that I think we see come up most frequently in our coaching with teams and with individuals, and actually even with the young girls that we mentor.
Yeah, I mean, I would add, I guess, another dimension to that, which is, I mean, there's often, which is really what our talk was a little bit about, there's kind of the personal story, and then there's the, how that relates to things around us. But one thing that the legal profession historically has not been good at is giving the right messaging to people that are working their way up and being trained and so on. The messaging is very old-fashioned and not very thoughtful as a means of empowering and resourcing people. This idea of you need to work hard and you need to do it this way, and it's so hierarchical. I mean, one of the principles in systemic work is orders. What are the orders of within the system? And the legal profession is so hierarchical in substance. You know, you've got the doctrine of precedent, you know, what comes first has authority over what comes after, but also structurally within the profession. And so it's very difficult for the younger generation coming up to see a way through that. They've either got to, you know, be daring and brave enough to break free and do things their own way, or they need leaders. And what's interesting and that I've found is, of course, you can have senior people who are leaders who can show the way and say, look, I do it differently, and I'm a member of the system, and so it's safe for you to do it differently too. But another thing often we find is that the junior people, by doing things differently, even in small ways, give permission to the senior people to do things differently. Because often the senior people are afraid to do things differently because they worry, what will the junior people think if I do it like this? They might think I'm a bit crazy, or I'm trying to be cool, or whatever it might be. And so for us, it's very much a dynamic between parts in the system. And and with all systems, if you shift one thing, even a little bit, and it might be the unexpected thing, it has a consequence, a ripple effect. So that kind of systemic dynamic that's in play, I think, is also another thing.
Yeah, courage and fear. Courage to do it differently. Sit with the tension of the fear, I might be shamed, I might be excluded, people might laugh at me or mock me, or they might not come out and defend this new, reaching out into the future way of doing things that improves everything for the greater good of all.
So you shared a couple of nuggets already of this systemic approach and how you work with your clients and your sort of approach to helping people, well, improve their lives. But I'm wondering for those, and I know you're going to be diving deep into this during your play shop, but I'm wondering for those who might not have a chance to attend or who might be watching at a later time, what are some of the sort of steps that you take in sort of unpacking this systemic relation that people have to their environments? And maybe you could sort of probe a couple questions that we can ask ourselves to begin to sort of begin this process.
Well, one of them, which for me was really the starting, was question everything that I believe. Because we're all born into a particular family, a particular culture, and in some ways we have no control over that. Some might call it fate. It's not that there's some high God that's controlled it, it's just that's how it happened. And once we can come into acceptance of this is how it is, this is how it was, it may have been difficult, by accepting it, we release ourselves to start to see and think through things in a different way. So it's the freedom from that which has bound us. I guess to condense it in simplicity, we can't control our fate, but we can choose our destiny. And that movement of releasing ourselves from the binds of one propels us forward to meet this future that is already coming to meet us. So that would be one of my starting points.
So I've got a few things, I guess, and building on that and your kind of call for questions. What questions can we ask ourselves? So I think in relationships, whether it's relationship with another or whether it's relationship to a thing, you know, my relationship to work, my relationship to conflict, whatever it might be, How is it? What is it like now, as Zita said, acknowledging the present, and how do I want it to be? In other words, accepting that you have agency and control, and relationship is something that you can create. It doesn't just happen. You can actually be purposeful and creative. That's one thing. Another thing is to really check in with one's feelings about whatever it might be. I mean, stress is a classic example of this. What am I feeling? Without judgment, not is this good or bad, but what am I feeling? And I guess the next question would be, and what can I learn from this? I mean, there's a great systemic saying, every problem is a solution in the making. And when we coach teams, it's the same thing. Conflict is the fuel for generative positive change. We embrace that. That's a great thing. But we tend to run away from it or shy away from it. More difficult to move through it. And if you can sit in that space of discomfort and say, what am I feeling and what can I learn from this? Then there's a lot that one can do.
Wow.
And one of the...
Thank you.
Oh, are we out of time?
We have, if you want to just share your last sentence. I know
the last one, it's about problems, because this is really what we're talking about, is problems. Problems exist because it is how we are describing the problem. If we were describing the problem correctly, we would know and have the solution, and there would be no problem to speak of.